Good morning, my friends. So, this is Paul again, and I just got back from recording my Catholic perspective on The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds' admittedly very bare bones story. So now I want to review the game, which thankfully is so much better than a story that, if you didn't look at the deeper symbolism, would be considered the epitome of lame by Zelda standards. So first off, I'm going to assume that by now you've watched all my other Zelda reviews, but on the other hand, those were all 3D Zelda games. A Link Between Worlds is the sequel to A Link to the Past, so it's the first Zelda game where the actual geometry of the map is almost identical to that of its prequel. In fact, my best friend, he played A Link to the Past first and played much more of it than I did. So there were a couple times where he'd be like, "Oh yeah, this is the route to the sanctuary." So it was the same map. The art style is very similar. In some respect, it's almost like a direct evolution of A Link to the Past, as though the other 3D Zelda games didn't happen. Something like that. So even though it draws a lot of inspiration from the game that came before it and makes a lot of really clever nods to what happened in that game and a few things here and there, it also is not afraid to branch out and try new things. Now, admittedly, the skeptic in me is going absolutely berserk when I first saw the trailer for that game, because don't get me wrong, I loved A Link to the Past in the day. But to see it butchered by the merging was just too much for me to handle. I said, oh my gosh, they're ruining Zelda, why? But then I decided to, give it a try. I said, okay, well, if it's a sequel to A Link to the Past, then it ought to at least be good. Boy, did playing that game make a difference. I felt the merging was so stupid when I saw it, but then when I actually played it, I don't think it's possible for me to imagine a top-down Zelda any other way anymore. So merging, if you're unsure what I'm getting at, is let's say that... Okay, so this book right here. Let's say that this is a 3D wall. Link would be able to press himself onto... Sorry, my webcam's weird. Onto the side of the wall and, shimmy along the surface, as long as the energy gauge lasted. And so it led to some of the most creative and ingenious puzzles I've ever seen in the Zelda series. They don't just use it as a gimmick. In fact, some boss battles even really creatively use it. But merging isn't the only thing that's great about this game. If you like A Link to the Past, you'll probably love this game because of all the really cool refinements that have come over the years. For instance, the circle pad allows Link to move much more flexibly. Link could only move in 8 directions on the Super Nintendo. Now you can move however you want. Also, things are faster, better animated. The music is especially a highlight. Most of the songs are either fully orchestrated or performed by live instruments. And another really cool thing about this game is that it controls like a dream. So, for instance, not only does Link handle smoothly, but the sword play is kept pretty basic. I mean, I know the previous handheld, core Zelda Spirit Tracks involved swiping a stylus to swing Link's sword, which might have confused some players. This time it's just the tap of a button, which is how A Link to the Past handled it, and a lot of people really liked that. Now, one thing that did kind of disorient me a little bit was how now, instead of Link just automatically holding out his shield, you actually have to hold down the R button for Link to hold out his shield manually, like in the 3D Zeldas, which took a bit of getting used to at first, but once I got the hang of it, it was pretty hard to go back. It really is quite effective, especially in the final battle. But what really makes A Link Between Worlds a joy to play is the contrast between how the field works and how the dungeons work. And somehow they just balance each other out so spectacularly. First off, fields. In Zelda games, typically they focus a lot on exploration. And while Twilight Princess probably seems like, at least until Breath of the Wild comes out, the biggest overworld in Zelda series, that's because you're looking at it from a 3D perspective. If you took a Link Between worlds, notice how there's a plural in there, it would probably be about the same size as Twilight Princess's, if not bigger. And thanks to the 3D slider, there's a sense of depth and height. So in other words, if Link is in a cave and he has to drop down onto a platform below him, you can actually tell with the stereoscopic 3D on that, whoa, that's quite a drop. And if Link fails, he's toast. Literally. And also, depth is really helpful, like when you're using a kuko to fly to a distant ledge, and you have to keep in mind how high in the air Link is. You know, subtle stuff like that that I'm not going to spoil, that just makes it takes two-dimensional Zelda into a direction that would never have been possible on previous hardware. So, in other words, like Super Mario 3D Land before it, which is still by far the best use of 3D that the 3DS has ever had, 3D helped redefine Zelda the same way it redefined Mario. So, the fields have a heavy sense of exploration to them. I absolutely loved being able to wander around every single nook and cranny and figure out where every fairy fountain was and every heart piece was, and also to see the contrast between Lorule and Hyrule, because now you have this button that lets you like see how each world is like mirror of the other. And it can actually serve some practical purposes too, like when you're trying to locate a dungeon. And in that game, instead of the magic mirror, you have these portals in the walls that you have to merge through to like shift literally between the worlds. And oftentimes finding those passages is the only way to navigate Lorule because the kingdom is, you know, crumbly. So instead of being one interconnected overworld like A Link to the Past's Dark World is, Lorule is very fragmented. And so each section is sort of like boxed off, and you have to find the appropriate entrance into each section from Hyrule. It sounds corny if you haven't played it, but it works, and eventually it gets addictive. Really addictive. And it also smooths transportation issues a lot if you're not the type that likes walking around. But of course, no Zelda game would be complete without fantastic dungeons, and thankfully A Link Between Worlds delivers magnificently. I mean, not only is it amazing that they kept the same number of dungeons, and I believe most of them are even in the same place as the ones in A Link to the Past, but they also managed to make the dungeons totally new, but yet at the same time very familiar at the same time, if that makes any sense. So for instance, the Eastern Palace. Yes, technically the design in and of itself is brand new. This is not a port, this is not a remake, this is a full-fledged sequel. But yet at the same time, it calls back to the Eastern Palace of old in many ways. For instance, just the way that the dungeon is designed, those rolling balls that for some odd reason hurt Link when he can't just, you know, push them out of the way, something like that. And even some of the bosses from A Link to the Past return, but now of course they're bigger, the stereoscopic 3D gives you a greater sense of scale, they're better animated, and some of them require entirely new tactics to beat them. I won't spoil it, but one particular boss uses merging very cleverly in ways that A Link to the Past owners would never even be able to wrap their minds around. So the dungeons, again, mostly focus on exploration. I mean, yes, there are a few puzzles here and there, but A Link to the Past was the first Zelda game to even have different kinds of rooms besides combat. So as a result, puzzles hadn't really been established as a huge staple in the Zelda series. That is pretty much the same here. Most of the dungeons in A Link Between Worlds revolve around finding the best way to defeat the enemies, because most enemies have specific weaknesses that'll either help you defeat them easier or defeat them at all, for that matter. Or finding ways in which you can get through the dungeon with maybe 1 or 2 items. Or try to find a creative way to get through the dungeons. Because in A Link Between Worlds, the item structure is a bit different. Now, admittedly, some purist Zelda fans are going to hate this decision no matter what rationale I give it. But in A Link Between Worlds, with a couple of minor exceptions, you don't actually get major items in the dungeons this time. All of the major items are within Ravio's shop. So you can choose to rent them, and then you get stupid rabbit ears on them. But even though it's really cheap to rent an item, you have to give it back to Ravio if you die. But then you can also buy the item for insane prices. The cheapest is like 800 rupees. The highest is 1200. But then after you buy it, you have an opportunity to upgrade it, which was also in A Link to the Past, which is cool that they brought that back. So as a result, yeah, people may be disappointed that when you open a chest in the dungeons, most of the time you're just going to get more rupees, or a key, or the compass, which now combines both the map and the compass together, which is kind of cool. And the touchscreen usage is incredible in the dungeons. I don't know if I've ever had more clear Zelda maps without having to pause the game every 2 seconds. Like, seriously, I wish more Zelda games would take advantage of this feature. And so as a result, the dungeons are designed in a way that you only need, like I said, about 1 or 2 basic items to make it through. But if you happen to have more items, you could try to find your own way to solve things. For instance, in the notorious water dungeon that seems to be the bane of every Zelda player's existence, I was able to beat the dungeon in about half the time that I normally did because I brought in an item that wasn't required in the dungeon, but I used it in a creative way to get further faster. So in other words, the game is much less linear than a typical Zelda. You can tackle the dungeons mostly in the order of your choosing, with a few minor exceptions. And there are so many side quests that this game like really encourages you to explore and discover and just really get to know every single nook and cranny, especially because this is definitely one of the harder Zelda games in recent memory. I say that because the 2D Zeldas of old are like stupid hard, so much so that I haven't even beaten any of them, but I managed to beat this game. But then, as if they don't think that's hard enough, because I only died once in my most recent playthrough, they have a hero mode. And this was back when the hero mode idea was still fresh. So you actually take sometimes more than triple the damage from enemies. When I first entered Lorule, the most basic of enemies could kill me in 1 hit. Like, yeah, you'll begin to regret that you never went into the potion shop in your original save through if you didn't play hero mode first. So, is there anything that I don't like about A Link Between Worlds? Well, I don't really like the story that much. I mean, with the exception of, in my previous video, I talked about the Catholic virtues. But if you're insistent on just saying, Paul, a story is a story, don't try to put religion into everything, it's pretty boring. Also, there's that weird factor a handful of times that still to this day kind of creeps me out. In a game that's supposed to be so serious as Zelda, you've got the person that upgrades your items like sucks the item into their mouth and then spits it out. Like, really? And then there's one predicament where Link has to deliver a scale back to the Zora Queen, and she's all like bloated and stuff, and it's like, okay, I can understand maybe why she needs the scale, but why did she have to be all bloated and crazy? Like, really? But, yeah, like I said, if you look past the weird factor, this game pays homage to A Link to the Past brilliantly. It may not be as fresh as A Link to the Past. I mean, this isn't how shall I word this? This isn't one of the more innovative Zelda titles, I'll give you that much. It mostly just, again, this seems to be a pattern with games that I like. It takes what worked in A Link to the Past and preserves it. It takes what didn't work and completely tosses it out the window. And then it takes good concepts and makes them better, but it doesn't butcher the experience. Now, granted, many of this is just my opinion. You feel free to disagree if you want. But I think we can all agree that as far as Zelda sequels go, which are surprisingly few, this is one of the better attempts. The much better attempts. So definitely give it a go if you have a 3DS, and prepare yourself for the upcoming epicness of Breath of the Wild. Hopefully I'll get around to making a video on my impressions of that. So thank you very much for listening to me ramble on for almost 16 minutes, and until the next time, keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye.